Why don't you talk to your family? It all started the day my older brother measured us both against the kitchen wall and saw I was 2 inches taller. He grabbed my shoulders hard enough to bruise. You need to stop growing right now because there's no way my little brother is going to be taller than me. I thought he was joking, but his face stayed deadly serious as he shoved me against the wall. I've been the tall one in this family for 23 years, and you're not changing that now just because you hit some freak growth spurt at 19. You realize I can't control how tall I grow, right? I asked, still thinking this had to be some weird prank. Then you better figure out how to control it, because if you keep growing, I'm gonna make your life so miserable you'll wish you were born without legs, he said, and our mom walked in just as he was shoving me hard enough to dent the drywall. 2 weeks later, he called a family meeting where he brought pamphlets about height reduction surgeries and demanded our parents pay for me to get my legs shortened. He had researched doctors in Brazil who would remove sections of my femurs and tibias to make me 4 inches shorter, complete with recovery timelines and testimonials from people who'd had the procedure for medical reasons. Our dad literally asked if he needed psychiatric help, while our mom just stared at him like she didn't recognize her own son. The family therapist he'd somehow convinced to attend told him that his request was not only unreasonable, but potentially criminal if he tried to force it, and my brother stormed out screaming that we'd all regret taking my side when I ended up ruining his life by being taller. I thought it was over, until he showed up at my college graduation wearing these massive platform shoes that had to be at least 6 inches tall. He marched right up to the stage as I was getting my diploma and announced to everyone that he was still the tallest sibling in our family, holding his arms up like he'd won something while wobbling on these ridiculous shoes. Then, he tried to stand next to me for the official photos and fell straight off the platforms in front of hundreds of people, landing so hard that everyone heard the crack when his ankle twisted the wrong direction. But instead of going to the hospital, he started injecting himself with black market human growth hormone right there on the graduation lawn, pulling syringes from his pockets and stabbing them into his thighs, while screaming that he'd grow 6 inches in 6 hours. His girlfriend tried to stop him, but he'd already injected 12 doses when he started convulsing, and his bones actually began stretching audibly, making these horrible popping sounds that made people vomit. He hung himself upside down from the graduation arch while his body seized from the hormones, saying gravity would help distribute the growth, and his spine started elongating so fast that his skin split open along his back. He stayed up there for 8 hours injecting more hormones every 30 minutes while blood dripped from the tears in his skin. And when paramedics tried to get him down, he climbed higher and tied weights to his ankles to stretch faster. His body went into shock when his organs couldn't keep up with his skeleton expanding, and he finally had a heart attack and fell 20 feet onto concrete, his bones having grown so rapidly and unevenly that his skeleton had literally deformed into something that barely looked human anymore. The doctors said the growth hormone overdose had caused his bones to grow in random directions, fusing joints at wrong angles, and giving him a permanent hunched shape that actually made him 3 inches shorter than before. Plus, he'd need dialysis for life because his kidneys had failed trying to process all the hormones. When I visited him in the ICU where machines were keeping him alive, he looked at me from his bed with his twisted body barely recognizable. "You did this to me by growing taller and making me feel like I had to compete," he said, while our mom held his malformed hand. "I'm permanently disfigured because you couldn't just stay shorter than your big brother like you're supposed to be. You injected yourself with enough growth hormone to kill a horse," I said, but our mom shushed me and said this wasn't the time. "If you had just stopped growing when I asked, I wouldn't need dialysis 3 times a week for the rest of my life," he continued, and our dad actually nodded like this made sense. I sat alone in my apartment afterward while my family rallied around my brother, everyone sharing how brave he was for surviving such a tragedy. The comments all asked what kind of monster would drive their own brother to inject himself with experimental hormones until his skeleton deformed, and I watched his GoFundMe donation counter hit 6 figures while people called me a sociopath for being tall. My family posted daily updates about his surgeries to straighten his twisted bones, and every single post mentioned how this never would have happened if his younger brother hadn't destroyed his identity. 3 weeks later, the sheriff knocked on my door with an arrest warrant, and my own parents had signed the criminal complaint. The sheriff held up the papers while telling me I had the right to remain silent and asking if I understood. My hands shook as I stood there, in just my boxers and an old t-shirt from college. I asked if I could at least put on some pants before we left. He nodded and followed me to my bedroom, standing in the doorway while I pulled on jeans and grabbed my wallet. The metal handcuffs clicked cold around my wrists behind my back. He led me down the apartment hallway, past neighbors who peeked through cracked doors. Outside, he opened the patrol car's back door and helped me duck inside without hitting my head on the frame. The seat felt sticky against my hands as I tried to get comfortable with my arms pinned behind me. Through the cage separating the front and back seats, I could see the criminal complaint paperwork on his clipboard. The words harassment and cyberstalking jumped out at me in bold print near the top of the form. As we drove, I leaned forward to read more of the complaint through the metal mesh. My brother had written pages claiming I'd been sending him threatening messages about his height for months. He listed specific dates and times when I'd supposedly sent texts saying I'd hurt him if he didn't accept being shorter. The lies were so detailed with exact quotes and timestamps that I wondered if he actually believed this stuff himself. At the jail, the booking officer took my handcuffs off and had me stand against a height chart for photos. The camera flashed while I held a plastic board with numbers under my chin. He rolled each of my fingers in ink and pressed them onto cards while asking about medical conditions and medications. I told him I was healthy, unlike my brother who needed dialysis 3 times a week from his hormone overdose. He just wrote none on the form and moved on to the next question about drug allergies. They gave me an orange jumpsuit that smelled like bleach and plastic slides for my feet. A guard led me through heavy doors that buzzed and clanked as they locked behind us. The holding cell had 3 other guys already sitting on metal benches bolted to the walls. I found an empty spot and sat down, trying not to think about my parents signing papers to have me arrested. The bench felt cold through the thin jumpsuit fabric. One guy with neck tattoos asked what I was in for. When I said being taller than my brother, he laughed and thought I was making a joke. I didn't bother explaining the whole insane story about growth hormones and platform shoes. We sat there for hours watching guards walk past the bars every 15 minutes on their rounds. My stomach growled since I hadn't eaten breakfast before the sheriff showed up. Finally, after 6 hours, a guard called my name and said I could make my phone call. The phone on the wall had no privacy, just a metal cord connecting it to a box. I pulled out the business card for a public defender's office that I'd kept from a college job fair years ago. The receptionist answered on the 3rd ring and took down my information. She said someone would call back within 24 hours, which felt like forever when you're sitting in jail. That evening around 7, a guard came to get me saying my lawyer had arrived. In the small interview room, a woman younger than I expected sat with a yellow legal pad. She introduced herself as Madeline Camp from the public defender's office. She had sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and took detailed notes as I explained everything from the beginning. I told her about the platform shoes at graduation and the hormone injections and how he ended up deformed. She kept writing without looking shocked, which made me feel slightly better. When I finished, she said she'd seen family disputes before, but this one was uniquely disturbing. She promised to get me out at arraignment tomorrow morning and started explaining what would happen in court. The next morning, guards brought several of us to the courthouse in a van with bars on the windows. They kept us in a holding area behind the courtroom until our cases were called. When my name came up, they brought me through a side door into the courtroom. My parents sat in the gallery but wouldn't look at me when I tried to make eye contact. Mom stared at her hands folded in her lap, while Dad looked straight ahead at the judge. The judge read the charges and asked how I wanted to plead. Madeline said not guilty and argued for reasonable bail since I had no criminal record and strong community ties. The prosecutor asked for $10,000, but the judge set it at $5,000 with a no-contact order. Madeline whispered that this was actually good news since harassment charges could have gotten higher bail. The judge said I couldn't contact my brother or parents directly or through third parties. After court, they took me back to jail to wait for bail processing. I called my bank and arranged to transfer $500 for the 10% payment to a bail bondsman. The paperwork took 3 more hours before they finally released me, with a bag containing my clothes and wallet. Outside the jail, I took an Uber back to my apartment since my car was still there. When I got home and checked my phone, my social media was flooded with hundreds of notifications. Someone had leaked my mugshot online, and it already had thousands of shares. People called me a monster who drove my brother to destroy his body with hormones. The comments said I should be locked up for what I did to him. My Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter were all full of hate messages from strangers who'd heard my family's version. I spent an hour blocking people and reporting death threats before finally just deactivating all my accounts. The next day, Madeline had me meet her at the public defender's office downtown. She explained that the prosecution would have to prove I actually sent threatening messages to win their case. Since I hadn't sent any messages like that, it would be hard for them to prove. She asked for access to all my phone records and email accounts to build our defense. I signed forms giving her permission to get everything from my cell provider and Google. She warned this could take months to resolve through the court system. That afternoon, I got an email from the company where I had a job interview scheduled for Friday. The HR person wrote that they were going in a different direction with the position. I knew it was because they'd run a background check and seen my arrest record. When you Google my name now, the first results are news articles about the arrest with my mugshot. Nobody wants to hire someone who looks like a violent criminal in their Google results. That same night, my phone buzzed with another notification from my brother's GoFundMe page. My parents had posted an update saying I was refusing to take responsibility for pushing him to the brink. The photo showed my brother in his hospital bed with his spine twisted at angles that didn't look human. Within hours, the donation counter jumped from $100,000 to over $200,000. The comments section filled with hundreds of people calling me a monster and saying I should be locked up for what I'd done. I scrolled through threats and hate messages until my hands started shaking so bad I dropped my phone. The next morning, I searched online for therapists who dealt with family trauma and found Caravan's website. Her office was in a small building downtown and I made an appointment for that afternoon. When I walked into her office, she had me sit on a brown couch while she took notes on a yellow pad. She asked me to tell her everything from the beginning, and I talked for almost the full hour. She stopped me a few times to write down words like enmeshment and gaslighting. She explained that my family had made me the scapegoat for my brother's mental illness. She said none of this was my fault, and my brother's choices were his own. After the session, I met Madeline at her office where she had bad news. She told me I needed to delete all my social media accounts immediately. She said any post or comment could be twisted to look like I was violating the no contact order. I sat there deleting years of photos and memories from Facebook and Instagram while she watched. She said one wrong move could send me back to jail, and we couldn't risk it. 2 weeks passed with me mostly staying in my apartment ordering groceries for delivery. Then Elliot Reed knocked on my door one evening looking worried. He said he was concerned about police showing up at his property, and other tenants were asking questions. He wasn't evicting me yet, but warned that if there was more drama, he'd have to reconsider my lease. I promised to keep things quiet, and he left, but I could tell he wanted me gone. The next day, Madeline called saying my brother had filed for a temporary restraining order. He claimed I'd been stalking him at the dialysis center, even though I hadn't left my apartment except for therapy and legal meetings. She said it was clearly false, but we still had to respond in court and prove I hadn't been there. That afternoon, I got an email from someone named Travis Lane, who said he was a reporter. He'd been investigating the graduation incident and found witnesses who saw my brother inject himself with hormones. He wanted to hear my side of the story and said he could help clear my name. Madeline told me not to respond yet, but to save his contact information for later. At my next therapy session, Kara explained how family dynamics work in situations like mine. She said my brother fit the golden child role despite his obvious problems because our parents couldn't accept his mental illness. I was the scapegoat who got blamed for everything that went wrong in the family. She said these patterns often take years to break if they ever break at all. She gave me worksheets about setting boundaries and recognizing manipulation tactics. That night, I got an unexpected email from Harper Molina, who I'd gone to college with. She said she'd recorded my brother's platform shoe incident and the hormone injections on her phone. She had clear video of him pulling syringes from his pockets and injecting himself while people tried to stop him. She was willing to testify about what really happened if I needed her to. This was the first good news I'd had in weeks, and I forwarded it to Madeline immediately. 3 days later, I had to go to the district attorney's office to meet with Antonio Meyer. He was younger than I expected, and actually seemed interested in hearing my version of events. He took detailed notes about the graduation incident and asked specific questions about the timeline. He wanted to know exactly when my brother arrived and when he started injecting himself. He asked if anyone else saw him bring the syringes and hormones. I told him about Harper's video, and he wrote down her contact information. He said he'd review all the evidence before making any decisions about the case. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following week at the courthouse. My brother appeared on a video screen from his hospital bed looking worse than before. His spine was so twisted he could barely sit up straight, even with pillows propping him up. He told the judge he feared for his safety and claimed I'd been sending him threatening messages. Madeline presented phone records showing I hadn't contacted him at all since the no-contact order. The judge looked through the evidence for several minutes before making her decision. She granted a limited restraining order that said I couldn't contact my brother but didn't require me to move. Madeline called it a partial victory since we'd prevented him from forcing me out of my apartment. After court, she said we were making progress, but warned me the criminal case could still take months to resolve. 2 days later, Madeline called me to her office with papers spread across her desk that made her eyes light up. She pushed the hospital's toxicology report toward me and pointed at the numbers circled in red ink. The report showed my brother had injected himself with enough growth hormone to kill 3 people, and the doctor's note specifically said no external force was involved in the administration. Madeline tapped the paper and told me this was huge for our defense, since it proved beyond any doubt that he did this to himself. The medical examiner had written that the injection sites were all self-inflicted, based on the angles and locations on his thighs. She photocopied the report 3 times and put them in different folders while explaining how this destroyed their whole case against me. That afternoon, a courier delivered an envelope from my parents' lawyer that made my hands shake as I opened it. The letter offered to drop all criminal charges if I signed a 2-page apology, admitting I had contributed to the family dysfunction through my behavior. They wanted me to agree never to speak publicly about the incident and to acknowledge my role in creating the toxic environment. I called Madeline immediately and read her the whole thing while she made angry noises on the other end. She told me to reject it completely, since signing would basically be admitting guilt for something I didn't do. The letter went into my growing file of evidence, while I tried not to think about my parents actually believing I deserved this. 3 days later, I sat in Kara's therapy office practicing something that felt impossible for me. She had me stand up and face her while she pretended to be my mom, demanding I apologize to my brother. I had to say no without explaining or defending myself, just a simple no that didn't leave room for argument. The first few times I automatically started explaining why I couldn't apologize for being tall. Kara stopped me each time and made me start over with just the word no. After an hour, I was getting better at not giving in to the urge to justify myself. She explained that my family had trained me to always cave to avoid conflict, but now I needed to break that pattern. The next morning, Madeline received a package from my phone company with printed copies of every text message between me and my brother. She spread them across her conference table, and we went through them one by one with a highlighter. There it was in black and white, a message from 6 months ago where he wrote that he would make my life miserable if I kept growing. Another one said I was ruining his identity by being taller, and that I'd regret it. Madeline took photos of each threatening message and said this completely contradicted his harassment claims. The texts showed who the real aggressor was, and she added them to our evidence file that was getting thicker every day. That same week, Travis Lane published his article about the dangers of black market growth hormone on a major news site. He used anonymous details from my brother's case, but anyone local would recognize the story. The piece explained how these hormones could cause bones to grow in random directions and organs to fail. He interviewed doctors who said the doses my brother took should have killed him instantly. Within hours, the article had been shared thousands of times, and the comments section exploded with people questioning the graduation story. Some commenters started connecting the dots and asking why someone would inject themselves with deadly hormones over height. Public opinion was finally starting to shift as people realized how insane the whole situation was. Antonio Meyer scheduled another meeting where he brought the EMT who had treated my brother at graduation. The EMT sat across from me and described exactly what he saw that day on the lawn. He said my brother was conscious and alert when they arrived, but refused to let them take him to the hospital. The EMT watched him pull out more syringes and inject himself while his girlfriend begged him to stop. He wrote in his report that family members were trying to prevent further injections, not encouraging them. Antonio took detailed notes and said this testimony would be crucial if the case went to trial. The EMT's statement directly contradicted my family's claim that I somehow forced my brother to hurt himself. That Friday, I got an email that made my stomach drop as I read it 3 times to make sure I understood. The freelance client I'd been working with for 2 years said they couldn't continue our contract. They wrote that they couldn't risk the brand association with someone involved in such a public criminal case. I'd been counting on that income to pay my legal fees and rent for the next few months. My savings account was already getting dangerously low from Madeline's retainer and therapy costs. I couldn't risk applying for new jobs since any background check would show the arrest. The walls felt like they were closing in as I calculated how many months I could survive without income. Meanwhile, Madeline had been busy with subpoenas and finally got the records from that family meeting 2 years ago. The therapist's notes were even more damning than we expected, calling my brother's demands inappropriate and potentially criminal. She had written that forcing someone to undergo height reduction surgery could constitute assault or coercion. The therapist recommended immediate psychiatric intervention for my brother's obsession with height dominance. These notes proved his fixation started long before graduation and had nothing to do with anything I did. Madeline added the therapist's assessment to our growing pile of evidence that painted a clear picture. During my next therapy session, Kara introduced a concept that felt like swallowing broken glass. She called it radical acceptance and explained it meant accepting that my family might never acknowledge the truth. They might never apologize or admit they were wrong about me. I had to accept this reality without waiting for them to change or hoping they'd eventually see my side. She said staying trapped in hope for something that would never happen would keep me stuck forever. The exercises she gave me involved writing letters to my family that I'd never send. I had to practice letting go of the need for their validation or understanding. It was the hardest thing she'd asked me to do because part of me still wanted my family back. A week later, my cousin forwarded me an email that felt like another knife in my back. My parents had sent a letter to every extended family member, claiming I was mentally ill and dangerous. They wrote that I had driven my brother to self-harm through psychological manipulation and shouldn't be trusted. The letter asked relatives to cut contact with me for their own safety and to support my brother's recovery. Reading my parents' lies sent to aunts and uncles I'd known my whole life hurt more than the criminal charges. They were systematically destroying every relationship I had left while painting themselves as victims. My cousin said she didn't believe it, but others in the family were taking my parents' side. The isolation was complete, as I realized I'd lost not just my immediate family, but my entire extended family too. Travis Lane called me again the next morning, and this time Madeline said I could give him one short statement about the threatening messages. I told him I never sent any messages to my brother, and Madeline had already given him my phone records as proof. He published the article that afternoon with my statement right next to a timeline, showing exactly when everything happened. For the first time, my actual words were out there instead of just my family's lies about me. The comment section started shifting, and some people were finally questioning my brother's version of events. Antonio Meyer called Madeline 2 days later with something huge he'd found during discovery. The shipping records from the medical supply company showed my brother had ordered 12 boxes of syringes and 20 vials of black market growth hormone 3 weeks before graduation. The delivery address was his apartment, and the signature on the receipt was definitely his handwriting. This completely destroyed any claim that he just randomly decided to inject himself because of something I did at graduation. Madeline immediately filed a motion to dismiss all charges based on the shipping records and all the other evidence we'd collected. She was excited about our chances, but warned me that judges rarely dismiss family violence cases even when the evidence is weak. The court would probably want a full hearing just to cover themselves legally in case something bad happened later. My phone buzzed with a text from my old college roommate saying my mom had contacted him asking him to talk to me. She wanted to work things out as a family without all these lawyers getting involved and making everything worse. I showed the message to Madeline, and she told me absolutely not to respond or have any contact through third parties. Cutting that last tie to who I used to be felt like ripping out part of my soul, but I deleted the message. Kara spent our next session helping me create a safety plan for what to do if my family showed up somewhere in public. We practiced phrases I could use to leave the situation without escalating anything if they approached me at the grocery store or somewhere else. She had me write down the local police number in my phone and reminded me I could call 911 if I felt threatened. We even practiced walking away while they were talking, which felt incredibly rude, but she said my safety was more important than being polite. Antonio Meyer discovered something else during his investigation that made him visibly angry when he told Madeline about it. My parents had sworn in their statements that certain events happened on specific dates, but hospital records proved my brother was already admitted for his hormone overdose on those dates. They'd literally made up events that couldn't have happened because my brother was unconscious in the ICU at the time. Antonio seemed personally offended that they were wasting the court's time with lies that could be proven false with basic fact-checking. Travis Lane interviewed a medical ethics professor from the state university about the height reduction surgery my brother had demanded. The expert called the idea of forcing someone to have their legs shortened a grotesque violation of bodily autonomy and basic human rights. The article reframed the whole conversation from family drama to attempted medical abuse and coercion. More people started realizing my brother's demands were completely insane and not just some sibling rivalry gone wrong. The judge finally scheduled our preliminary hearing for 3 weeks out, but denied Madeline's motion for immediate dismissal. The order said the allegations were serious enough to require full examination, even if the evidence seemed contradictory. Madeline said this was normal procedure, and judges always err on the side of caution with family violence cases. She started preparing me for what would happen at the hearing and what questions I might have to answer. I spent the next 4 days at Madeline's office creating a detailed timeline of every single interaction with my family for the past year. We went through my calendar, texts, emails, and social media to document everything that had happened before graduation. Seeing it all laid out chronologically made the pattern so obvious that even I was shocked. My brother's obsession had been growing for months with increasingly crazy demands and threats that I'd somehow normalized because they happened gradually. The timeline showed him researching height reduction surgery 6 months before graduation and joining online forums about height dominance. Kara helped me write a victim impact statement during our next session, even though we might not need it. She said to focus on the emotional damage and isolation, rather than attacking my family's character directly. We worked on describing how the false accusations had destroyed my life without sounding angry or vindictive. She kept reminding me that showing the human cost was more powerful than trying to prove my family were bad people. The statement took 3 sessions to finish because I kept breaking down while writing about losing everyone I'd ever loved. Madeline reviewed it and said it was perfect because it showed the real consequences of false allegations without being aggressive. She filed it with the court along with all our other evidence and discovery materials for the preliminary hearing. 2 days later, Antonio Meyer called the family therapist who had been at that crazy meeting with the pamphlets, and I sat in Madeline's office while she took notes on the speakerphone conversation. The therapist remembered everything clearly and told Antonio that my brother's demands for me to get surgery were not just weird, but actually concerning from a professional standpoint. She said she'd told my parents right after the meeting that they should get him psychiatric help immediately because forcing someone to have their legs shortened was basically medical abuse. Antonio asked her to put it all in writing for the court file, and she agreed to send over her notes from that day plus her professional opinion about my brother's mental state. While we waited for the therapist's statement to arrive, I got an email notification that made me check my phone even though Madeline was still talking about evidence. The GoFundMe page had changed, and when I pulled it up on my laptop, huge chunks of text were missing, including all the parts that blame me for my brother's injuries. Someone had reported it for containing false information, and the platform actually reviewed it and removed the worst lies about me driving him to hurt himself. The donation counter was still at 200,000, but at least new people wouldn't see those awful accusations when they visited the page. Madeline said this was good for our case because it showed even a neutral platform found the claims against me questionable enough to remove them. That afternoon, a letter arrived from my parents' attorney proposing something called a mutual no-contact agreement that would last for 1 year and basically make official what was already happening with none of us talking to each other. Madeline read through it carefully and pointed out that they weren't admitting any wrongdoing, but seemed to be looking for a way to make this all go away without actually apologizing or taking back their lies. She said we should consider it, but not agree to anything until after the preliminary hearing, since the judge might dismiss everything anyway, and then we'd have more leverage to negotiate better terms. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and document review, until suddenly it was the night before the preliminary hearing, and Madeline had me come to her office for one last session to go over what would happen. She walked me through every possible question the prosecutor might ask, and made me practice my answers until they were short and simple, and impossible to twist into something bad. She kept reminding me not to get emotional or angry, no matter what anyone said, because the prosecutor would try to make me look unstable or aggressive to support my family's claims. We practiced for 3 hours until my responses were automatic, and I could answer even the worst accusations calmly without defending myself too much or attacking my family's character. I was walking to my car after the prep session when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize, but when I played it, I heard my dad's voice for the first time in months. He sounded tired and old as he said he didn't understand how things got so bad between us and that he was confused about everything that had happened since graduation. He didn't apologize or admit they'd lied about me, but just hearing him sound unsure instead of angry felt like the first crack in their united front against me. I saved the voicemail and forwarded it to Madeline, who said it might be useful if they tried to claim I was the one refusing contact. Meanwhile, Travis Lane had been working on an article about the hearing and called to say he would publish it the day after with all names and identifying details removed to protect everyone's privacy. He said public interest had shifted from anger at me to curiosity about how a family could destroy itself over something as stupid as height difference, and that readers wanted to understand the psychology behind it more than assign blame. The morning of the preliminary hearing arrived, and I put on my only suit and drove to the courthouse where Madeline was already waiting with her files and laptop ready to present our evidence. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with just a few rows of benches, and my parents were already sitting in the back row avoiding eye contact when I walked in. Antonio Meyer stood at the prosecutor's table, arranging his papers, and when the judge entered, we all stood while she took her seat and opened the case file. Antonio started with a neutral summary of the charges against me, reading from his notes about the harassment and cyberstalking allegations, while also mentioning that the discovery process had raised questions about the validity of these claims. He seemed like he was going through the motions because he had to, but his tone suggested he personally thought this whole case was a waste of the court's time. The judge asked him to present his evidence, and he called his first witness, but before anyone could testify, Madeline stood up and asked permission to show a video that would save time and clarify the key events. The judge agreed, and Madeline connected her laptop to the courtroom screen, and suddenly there was Harper's graduation video playing for everyone to see in clear detail. The footage showed my brother climbing the graduation arch himself, while people below begged him to come down and then injecting himself with syringe after syringe, while his girlfriend tried to grab them away from him. You could hear him screaming about needing to be taller than me, while his body convulsed from the hormones, and the judge watched without any expression as my brother's self-destruction played out in real time. When the video ended, Madeline called the EMT who had responded to the scene, and he testified that my brother was alert and oriented when he arrived and had specifically refused treatment while saying he needed to get taller than his younger brother. The EMT read directly from his report that my brother had been injecting more hormones even as the paramedics tried to convince him to stop, and that he'd said multiple times that he couldn't let me be taller than him. This testimony completely contradicted my family's story about me somehow forcing or driving him to hurt himself, and even Antonio looked uncomfortable as the evidence mounted. After the EMT finished, Antonio stood up slowly and looked at the judge for a long moment before speaking in a clear voice that carried through the small courtroom. He said that in the interest of justice and based on the evidence presented, the state was moving to dismiss all charges against me due to insufficient evidence and contradictory witness testimony that made prosecution impossible. The judge nodded and said she would review the motion, but called a brief recess first to consider everything she had seen and heard. 20 minutes passed before the judge came back into the courtroom, and everyone stood up again while she sat down and shuffled through her papers. She looked directly at me for a moment, then at my parents, who were sitting in the back row, and cleared her throat before speaking in a firm voice that filled the small room. She said the charges against me were dismissed with prejudice, which meant they could never be filed again, and that the criminal justice system wasn't meant to be used as a weapon in family disputes like this one. My parents got up and left immediately without even glancing in my direction, while Madeline squeezed my shoulder and told me it was over. Really over this time. The judge then signed the mutual no-contact order that would last 18 months, giving everyone time to cool off or at least stop actively trying to destroy each other. And Madeline explained this would protect me from any more false accusations, while also giving my family a way to save face by saying the court ordered them to stay away. Antonio Meyer's office put out a short statement the next day, saying the charges had been dismissed due to lack of evidence, nothing more. But it was enough to slow down the worst of the online harassment, even though plenty of people still believed my family's version of events. That Thursday, I went to see Kara, and we spent the whole session working through the weird mix of relief and grief I was feeling, because even though I'd won legally, I'd still lost my entire family in the process. She helped me understand that I could mourn the parents and brother I wished I had, while still protecting myself from the ones I actually had, and that both feelings were valid and didn't cancel each other out. 2 weeks went by before a letter arrived from my parents' lawyer with what they called an apology for involving law enforcement in a family matter, though they didn't admit to lying or acknowledge that I hadn't done anything wrong in the first place. Madeline read it over and said this was probably the most accountability I'd ever get from them, and that I should consider it a small victory that they'd even sent anything at all. Then Deacon Reed knocked on my door one afternoon to tell me he'd heard through his hospital connections that my brother had checked into a 6-month residential program that specialized in body dysmorphia and self-harm behaviors. He said the program was supposed to be really good, and maybe my brother would finally get the help he'd needed all along, instead of blaming everyone else for his problems. A month after that, I got a call from a company where I'd applied before all this started. And they said they'd looked into the actual case details instead of just seeing an arrest record and were impressed by how I'd handled such a difficult situation. They offered me a position starting in 2 weeks, and I also found a new apartment across town where I could really start fresh without Elliot Reed watching my door nervously every time I came home. 6 months passed, and I was sitting in my new place with a decent job, still seeing Kara every other week to work through everything that had happened, building a life that had nothing to do with my family's chaos. The no-contact order was still in place. My brother was still in treatment, according to what Deacon had heard, and even though I'd never have the family I wanted, I'd found some peace in accepting who they really were and choosing to protect myself first. All right, that's it from me today. Thanks for tagging along while I wondered about all this random stuff. It's been a fun ride, like the video. It helps more than you think.